Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
You're watching Adventures in Music Theory with your host, Dr. Robbins. It's Wednesday, it's April 29th, and it's time to start the final chapter of your music theory textbook. This is the last thing I'm going to teach you before your 2-year music theory sequence is over. And today we're going to start talking about variation forms. And variation forms I gave a little build up to in our last class, but as I mentioned, they've been around a long time. You can find them pretty much in every historical era and in every musical culture there is, because it's a very accessible formal type. It's very adaptable. You can do a lot with it. And variation forms are based on a rather simple idea. I think y'all are going to like these. They're rather easy to approach analytically, because the idea behind variations is this. It's the idea that we hear something and then we hear it repeated and altered. So in variation forms, we actually have a formal type that's dealing with those two things we've sort of framed all of form and analysis in, unity and variety. And when we're looking at a variation form, we're looking at a formal type that manages to work with both of those at the same time. Variation is based on the idea that we hear something and we hear something repeated, and that repetition creates unity. But it's also based on the idea that we hear it altered, and those alterations or variations create variety. So variation forms work rather cleverly that way, based on the idea of hearing something and then hearing it again, but hearing it with some slight differences. And let's talk about how variation forms have worked historically. It's common to divide variation forms into two different types. We talk about continuous variations and we talk about sectional variations. And continuous variations are simply variations that occur over a repeating pattern. They're basically variations that happen over a little musical loop. There's something that keeps going over and over and over again. It could be a very short musical idea, or it could be a slightly longer musical idea, but there's a pattern, and we'll talk more about what pattern might be like in a couple minutes here. And as that pattern repeats, different things start happening over it. And those different things create the variations. That's how continuous variations work. And those are the ones that are common to all sorts of different musical cultures and different musical eras. When we talk about sectional variations, those are a little bit more restricted to Western music, and particular to classical style and romantic style and things like that, where whenever you go to a concert and there's a piece on the program or a movement called theme and variations, those are pretty much guaranteed to be sectional variations. And sectional variations are basically variations where you have a complete musical theme that can be like a little miniature composition almost, and then you have a series of variations that are like little miniature movements on that original theme. And today I want to focus on continuous variation types. There are basically three ways continuous variations can shake out. One way is this. As I mentioned, continuous variations are based on the idea of there being a pattern that repeats, and then new things happen over that repeating pattern. And one way those repeating patterns can happen is this. Continuous variations can occur over a rhythmic and melodic pattern, and that pattern occurs in the same register or the same voice. Like for instance, a rhythmic or melodic pattern just means it has a definite rhythm and a definite set of intervals or something like that. It might be this little pattern. We could use it. And as this pattern plays, different things could happen over it. And that's not one I made up. That's a Led Zeppelin song. But it's a good example of how these continuous variations might happen. There's a pattern, there's a definite rhythm, and there's a definite interval pattern that goes there, a definite melodic pattern that goes there. And that pattern is fixed in register. It stayed in the same place. A lot of times they like to stay in the lowest voice. So that's one popular way that continuous variations can happen. So this second type we're talking about, it's similar to the first. It's got a repeated rhythmic melodic pattern. But in the first, when we talk about it, we're talking about that rhythmic melodic pattern staying in the same place. It's always the lowest part, or it's always the highest part. In this second type, that repeated rhythmic melodic pattern can change places. It can move. Sometimes it might be the lowest part, but sometimes it might be the highest part. So it can move around. And this third type of continuous variations, there's not a fixed rhythmic melodic pattern. It's just a series of chords that are played. And they can be played with changing rhythm, and they can be moved to different registers or whatever. Like for instance, I might take this real simple chord progression and just keep repeating it. But I can change up the rhythm if I want it. Or I can change the voicing. And I'm playing the same chords every time, but I'm not really playing a consistent rhythm or a consistent voicing. And that's how the third type of continuous variations works. It's more loosely defined. It's just the same harmonies over and over again, while new melodic things happen over them. This might sound like some things we've looked at before. It might be familiar. We'll see as we move on down the road here. And here's one of those I've got good news and I've got bad news moments. The good news is this. All these continuous variation types have names that they might go by. They might be called chaconne, or they might be called ground or ground bass, or they might be called passacaglia. That's the good news. We have names for these things. The bad news is this. Nobody can really agree on what they mean. Throughout history, composers have used these three terms rather loosely. They've been rather specific about what ground or ground bass means, but those other two terms, chaconne or passacaglia, depending on who's writing a piece, one guy might call a chaconne that another composer would call a passacaglia. Those two terms are not well defined. And if you find somebody who tells you they are, they're not entirely correct. Because looking through music history, you'll realize these titles have been applied to all sorts of continuous variation types. They don't necessarily match up neatly with the three types of continuous variations I've shown you. And I want to actually listen to some examples of those variation types now. So let's do some listening to some rather cool music. See you on the next slide. All right, so this is a Monteverdi piece from the early 17th century called Zeffiro Torna. And it's an example of that first type of continuous variation where you have a fixed rhythmic melodic part that stays in the same register and is repeated. It's a good example of what a lot of composers would call a ground bass, because that fixed part happens in the bass part. It's this little line. That happens in the lowest voice all the way through this. See, here's the next page of the score, and if you keep looking at that bottom line in each system, you'll see that it's just the same little bass pattern going over and over and over again. Like I say, a lot of people would consider this a ground or a ground bass. Of the three terms that are used, chaconne, passacaglia, and ground bass is the most trustworthy. Although, ironically, Monteverdi called this piece a ciaccona, which is Italian for chaconne. But when you hear it, you'll see it's based on the idea of this pattern being repeated. And this is an early music group performing it, and they add a lot of improvisation, so it's not going to necessarily sync up with what you see on the page there. And I'm not going to go back to the beginning, but here's what the piece sounds like. It's very cool. Actually, this version is cooler. I want to hear this one. Listen to the bass. Notice that pattern keeps going. I told you it was cool. Especially for early 1600s, it's quite cool. But that's a good example of how a ground bass might work, or how that style of music that's based on a repeated pattern that stays in one register, usually the bass, works. And I suppose I might be remiss to not talk about potentially the most famous of all of the ground basses out there. Although we looked at this piece last week as an example of a contrapuntal genre, of a canon. This is the Pachelbel canon. And it's an accompanied canon, as I said. And the thing that accompanies it is the ground bass pattern, that thing that the cello plays throughout the piece. Listen to the cello part. And notice how it keeps doing that. And here we go again. And again. again. And notice how different stuff's happening in the violins and the melody above it. But the cello and bass just keeps coming back to that same pattern. Here they go again. And there are different things happening while that pattern keeps repeating. And that is the essence of variation form. We hear something repeated and we hear something changed added to it. Now if we were going to talk about that second way continuous variations happen, where there's like a repeated pattern of rhythm and melodic intervals that moves to different registers, a great example I could use would be this piece, the Bach Passacaglia and Fugue in C minor. And again, he's used the word Passacaglia to describe this piece. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is exactly what a Passacaglia is and the only thing a Passacaglia can be, but what Bach does is he's got a repeated rhythmic and melodic pattern. It's that little thing that's on a staff all by itself at the beginning. And he repeats that throughout the piece, and there are quite a lot of variations that happen above it. I'm just going to let it start playing. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I'm going to let it start playing, and then I'm going to cut ahead to another part of it so you can see what makes it special. But here it is at the beginning. At the beginning, it actually seems like it could be a ground or something because this repeated pattern stays in the lowest register and everything happens above it. Okay, so here's the end of it. We're going to repeat it and we're going to add stuff to it. Here we go through it again. But notice how the chords up high are different. And the next time through he's going to add eighth notes. Here we go. We'll just listen for a second. Okay, and I'm going to pause it there because I want to look at something that happens later in the piece. So perhaps you've noticed I've been putting all these little red boxes around the repetitions of that little Passacaglia theme that he keeps repeating. And this happens many measures into the piece, but up through what you heard, Bach was basically treating the piece like a composer might treat a ground-based piece, where that little pattern was staying in the lowest voice all the way through there. But there comes a moment later on in the piece where, and you can see it marked in the red boxes there, where Bach lets that Passacaglia theme move to the highest register. And while that Passacaglia theme's up in the highest register, you'll notice that there's a lot of variation and a lot of ornamentation with 16th notes going on beneath it. The variations are happening below it now. So I want to listen to it. We're going to hear the variation coming into it where Bach is actually keeping his Passacaglia theme low, but he's going to shorten up the rhythmic values a little bit. But here we go coming into this section. Here we go. It's still down low. Boom, 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 boom. And listen, now it's going to shift up high. And again. And we'll just keep listening even though we can't see it. Okay, so you see how that works, this idea that you keep repeating the same rhythms and pitches, but you move them to different places. They go from being the bass part to being an upper part or a middle part. Doesn't have to be called Pasacaya if you do that. And let's look at one more work also called Pasacaya that takes that same approach. And this is, remember the Heaven and Hell fugues from the last time we were talking about fugue? Well, this is that same guy and that same album, Joe Jackson. And one of his 7 deadly sins, rather than using fugues to depict it, he used a Pasacaya to depict the deadly sin of sloth. It's kind of a good thing to depict it too if you think about it, you know, because what does a Pasacaya do? It kind of gets in a rut. It just keeps going and doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. It's kind of a lazy or slothful musical form that way if you think about it. But I'm going to play a bit of this because you have to listen for a while to hear the thing that happens take place, which is you get to hear that little bass line that starts the piece out move to the upper voices. So let's just give a listen here. Notice how it feels like it keeps trying to get out of B minor. And it keeps getting pulled back. And here comes a bassoon or two. And here it sounds like it's going to go to G major. Nope, back in B minor. Can't get out of its rut. Now it sounds like it's going D minor. And then we get pulled back into B minor again. So that little repeated pattern stays in the bass, like it's a ground bass. Always the same rhythm, always the same pitches. And for now, always in the lowest register. But different things keep happening on top of it. This little dialogue between the bassoons keeps changing its melody, but the bass line keeps just doing the same old thing. And look, he even brings in some new instrumental sounds here. Now, got those little bell-like keyboards, but if you listen underneath in the bass voice, you can tell that we're still hearing the same thing we've been hearing. That same Pasacaya bass line. Boom, 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 boom. Here we go again. Boom, boom. can probably appreciate that the melody that the soon is playing keeps changing and it's more cantabile and song-like. So there's interesting stuff going on melodically over the repetition of the bass theme. And here comes our voice.
Give me a bud and a slice. Leave me alone if I want your advice. I'll ask you, you tell me caviar's nice, but I wouldn't know. So what's it to you? Who needs your help?
Get ready.
You might grow. Look at the sun.
Do you hear how it changed? It's in the high violins, pizzicato now. It's not a bass line anymore. Well,
See how it hangs so still in the sky.
and now it's going to go back to the bass here.
Give me the new TV guide. Get off the phone. Go on and take sides. It's not my problem. Waiting for worlds to collide in the comfort of home. They say Lucifer's free. What shall we do? Don't ask me.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, as much fun as it is to listen to that. But you got to see that his approach was the same approach Bach took. Have a pattern, started in the low register, keep repeating it, same pitches, same rhythms, and then at some point it goes and becomes a high voice pattern. But there's other stuff going on above it or under it. In fact, one thing I've kept at the bottom of the page there you can see is that's Joe Jackson's actual definition of a Passacaglia. A Passacaglia is an old variation form where you have a theme, which is quite often a bass line, which repeats itself, and there are variations around it which go above and below it. Now, that's not the only way a Passacaglia can happen, but that's the way Joe Jackson made one happen, that's the way Bach made one happen. Let's look at that third variation type now. So here's that third type of continuous variation where there's not a rhythmic and melodic thing that's being repeated. All that's being repeated is the same harmonic progression. And that's what happens in this Handel piece. If you look at any group of measures, this is a 4-measure long variation form. Every 4 measures are a variation on the 4 measures before them. And you'll realize you don't see any repeated rhythms or pitches happening, but what you do see is that the harmonic analysis is pointing out that the chord progression doesn't change. It's just this circle of fifths progression that goes 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1 all the way through. Even as Handel changes things up. You know, in the very, very first system, he's playing dotted 8th notes and 16th notes, and he's got a very thick texture. And in the second system, he switches to 8th notes, but he's still got a thick texture, and he's got that heavy bass line with octaves. And then in the third system, suddenly it's a thin 2-voice texture with quarter notes in the bass and 8th notes in the right hand. And then in the fourth system, he switches and it's quarter notes in the right hand and 8th notes in the bass, but a thin texture still. Let's give it a listen and see what it sounds like here, because listen to the harmonic progression. Here we go. I will repeat those measures. Get the chords in your ear. 6, 2, 5. Here we go. Thinner texture. Now flip it. And let's keep listening. 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. So see, he does a lot to change things, but he keeps playing the same progression of chords. But by the end there, he was like even playing triplet rhythms and stuff. And interestingly enough, notice that Handel calls this piece a Passacaglia, but it's not like Bach's or Joe Jackson's. And it's a good proof of that thing I said about how musicians have been rather haphazard with how they apply the terms. You know, Handel builds his Passacaglia very different from Bach's. He builds it just by repeating the same chord progression. And that was going on before Handel, and it's going on still today after Handel. Let's look at some more. For instance, one place where this idea of repeating harmonic progressions goes on that we've already talked about in the song forms unit is the 12-bar blues. Remember how the 12-bar blues works? Is basically it's a bunch of chord changes that happen over maybe 12 measures. But a 12-bar blues is an example of a continuous variation type based on a repeating harmonic progression, because that's how the blues works. You play the 1, 4, 5 chords in that particular arrangement that happens in the 12-bar blues, and as musicians play it and repeat it, different things happen over the chord progression. Singers sing or soloists take improvised solos, but the thing that's constant and holds it together is that repetition of the 12-bar blues progression. But I don't actually want to play any blues today. Instead, what I want to look at is a more recent song, and I could find more recent songs than this, that illustrates this idea of just the same chords being repeated, but different things happening over it. This song, it's a Radiohead song, and it's basically the same progression of F sharp minor, A, and E all the way through. And that's all that happens, even though when you hear the song, it doesn't feel like that's all that happens, because it has very clearly defined verses and choruses, like a lot of pop songs do. But even though those sections are very differentiated, it's always the same chords going on. So let me just play this song for y'all, and you can see how much they managed to like create variations over that repetition of the same 3 chords over and over again. Here we go. Okay, here we go. A, E. F sharp minor. A, E. Get used to it, it's going to keep happening. First verse.
Jumps in a week, but you think that's pretty clever, don't you, boy? Flying on your motorcycle, watching all the ground beneath you drop. You kill yourself for recognition, kill yourself to never ever stop. Broke another mirror, you're turning into something new.
Here comes the chorus.
Don't leave me home. Don't leave me dry. Don't leave me home. Don't leave me dry.
Now we have a little interlude built on the same chords. F sharp minor, A, E. And another verse.
Drying up in conversation, you'll be the one to kind of talk. All your insides fall to pieces, you just sit there wishing you could still make love.
Remember the chords. F sharp minor,
Ones who hate you when you think
A,
you got the world,
E.
so stars.
F sharp
They're
minor.
the ones who spit at you.
Okay.
You will be the one
E.
screaming
Here comes the
out.
chorus again.
Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Don't leave me.
And I'm stopping it there, but you can guess what's going to happen harmonically as it goes on. So you can see how that song's based on repetition of a chord pattern. But as the chord pattern repeats, the melodic ideas above it change. Sometimes they're verses, sometimes they're choruses, sometimes they're instrumental interludes, sometimes they're the guitar solo that we were hearing at the ending there. So this idea of how continuous variations might operate, it's got a lot of adaptability. It can be used in a lot of musical situations, and my guess is if you go listen to music today that's still coming out, you'll notice that this approach to variation form is still very alive and well. And speaking of very alive and well, I'm hoping that that's how we would all describe ourselves right now as well. So let's call it a day until Friday. And for next time, what I want you to do is read through Unit 27. Read it bittersweetly because it's the last unit in the theory book. And look at the first homework assignment for Unit 27. It's a piece by Henry Purcell called Dido's Lament. Perhaps y'all know it. We tend to have a fair amount of people performing it on recital hour around Converse, actually. So look at that piece, figure out what's going on with it formally. We'll talk about it on Friday, and we will talk about sectional variations. But until then, stay healthy and safe and sane, and I will see you next time.